One of the big geopolitical issues going on in the world today, outside of course the Ukraine war, is the tensions in the South China Sea and in the Asia Pacific region. And right now, that of course is focused around Taiwan and Nancy Pelosi's visit. I made a video, of course, when this happened, but there's two articles, two op-eds, I should say, in different newspapers, one the Daily Mail and one the Times, that take quite a different outlook on this. In both cases, Roger Boyce for the Times and Mark Almond for the Daily Mail, they both praise Pelosi's courage, but where Almond questions it, Boyce is more optimistic or more supportive of the decision. So I'm not going to read out the whole articles because it'd just be too long, but I'll show you the articles. These are both from August the 3rd. So this is Mark Almond in the Daily Mail. A noble stance, but she's dousing the fiery breath of the Chinese dragon with petrol. By contrast, Roger Boyce in the Times, Nancy Pelosi is right to face down Xi's threats. So I have mixed views on this myself. I've long been a China watcher, not professionally speaking, but it's a part of the world I'm very interested in, from personal experience. I've lived and worked in China twice. I have a lot of Chinese contacts, friends, that is. But I'm a long-standing critic of the CCP, and I've never been shy of that on this channel. It's not something that comes up with my Chinese friends, which is it's a strange position to be in because they're my friends. I've got good memories with them. Some of them, they've been supportive of me. I've been supportive of them in various capacities. And there's joint memories there. But politics is something that does not come up. On the rare occasion that it did come up, it was, as you can imagine, awkward and semi-confrontational. Why? Because a lot of my Chinese friends are a product of their society. That is to say that they're intelligent people, but they are very much influenced by being in a single party state that utterly controls the narrative. So even if they hear Western sources or dissident sources, it's a knee jerk tendency to defend the CCP and is very, very deeply embedded in the Chinese psyche. Because a lot of this is to do with face, this idea that they might even say we don't agree with everything the CCP does, but there's still this tendency of losing face, this idea, well, China's being criticized, so we have to defend China. The nationalism is intense. It's very, very, it's almost like a religion there. And I'm not saying it's the only part of the world where this can be found, but it's very, very deeply embedded. I remember seeing it's one advantage actually having been in the country, but you see this stuff firsthand. I remember Monday mornings, I used to go to class. Well, actually, the whole school would be out in the yard. It was big yard. Um, and I would be, yeah, probably going to class to prepare the lesson or just walking through. And I never felt threatened, but it was a little bit uneasy being the only Westerner there and seeing this basic, it's almost like a political rally, slightly unnerving. When I know, although my Chinese was limited, I knew full well what the content was because some of my students explained to me that it was about teaching patriotism. And so I knew what it was about. I didn't really hang around, not because I felt threatened, but just because it made me uneasy. Um, so I would either, prepare the lesson or just go back to my apartment or wherever it was. So I've seen firsthand how intensely that patriotism is drilled in. Now, you might say in American schools they have the flags in classrooms. I don't think it's comparable, because although the United States certainly drills in patriotism to an extent, It's not like a 5 hour lecture on a Monday morning, or whatever that was. It was quite extensive. I'm exaggerating, probably wasn't 5 hours, but it was long. It was long and it was intense, and the students had to stay there and hear it. Chinese children in kindergartens are told, this is all relevant to the video, by the way. Chinese children are told to love the motherland, and it's these nice little sunny pictures of the mighty Chinese army defending the country and things like this. And that's what they're trying to do in Hong Kong. They're actually organizing Hong Kong students now to go to the mainland on patriotic tours. The good news is you cannot dupe millions of Hong Kongers who know better. No matter how much they try to brainwash them, the extent of opposition is such that I think it will fail. This is not to say it's easy for the Hong Kongers, those who, yeah, there are Hong Kongers who support Beijing, but there are many, many others who don't, and they don't want to just become another communist clone, and they don't want a situation where they're blindly listening to the CCP's lies, false narrative. Because I don't think, for example, they could tell the Hong Kongers that Tiananmen never happened. I think that's almost impossible because every single year until recently, that event has been commemorated in Hong Kong. So how are they going to explain? Oh, just had an itch there. All those commemorations they can't. So this again comes down to this idea that we can sometimes overestimate China's power. That is the nature of it. It's one of the biggest tools they use, and I think it's one that is not spoken about enough. The nationalism is intense, and it is exported to the diaspora. But I've spoken about that before, so I'm not going to go into that too much. On this visit, there may be I've mixed feelings. I mean, Pelosi's 82; she's probably going to retire soon, so it might be kind of her last hurrah. There may be a little bit of egoism involved in that, maybe. I don't doubt that it is politically courageous. Why? It's not that the CCP is necessarily going to harm her personally, but she knew that she would be a target of their vitriol. She knew that she'll be a hate figure in China now. So I do think the knowledge that you're going to be subjected to hate by millions of people takes a degree of courage. I do. Um, Nancy Pelosi, I didn't realize this, but back in 1991, I assumed she was a junior diplomat then or a junior congresswoman. Back then, she apparently unfurled a banner in Tiananmen Square and was kicked out of the country. So this is a woman who has a track record of being a China hawk, and I give her huge credit for that. In fact, I have to say the whole thing is elevated Nancy Pelosi in my mind. Although there's other areas I wouldn't agree with her on, definitely her pandering to the woke left in America, but that's for another video. Um, so I'm going to just pick out little segments of this. It is abridged because I can't read out the whole thing, but I want to touch on some things because I think both writers make good points. I don't think there's going to be an imminent war in that part of the world, but I do think this is going to be one of those near run incidents. I mean, if you've seen the James Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies, this plot line in that is Elliot Carver, played by Jonathan Price, is this power crazy media mogul who instigates a war between Britain and China in that part of the world. Of course, 1997, China was a lot less powerful than it is today. And that coincidentally was also the year when the last high ranking US official visited Taiwan, then Republican Speaker Newt Gingrich. But at that time, China had to basically toe the line quite carefully because they were looking to enter the World Trade Organization. And in order to do that, or the World Economic Forum, it was one of those two bodies. But in order to do that, they had to basically grit their teeth because they needed the Clinton administration's approval to do so. Now they're in a much more emboldened position because they're more powerful. Um, and never underestimate how totalitarian states, particularly Russia and China, will look to internal divisions in America. Apparently, Biden was uncomfortable about this. He preferred Pelosi not to go, but and apparently he said this on a phone call to Xi that he doesn't have the power as president to tell the leader of Congress to tell the speaker what to do. The problem is that doesn't really relate to the Chinese way of thinking, because the Chinese don't consider that Western governments have different bodies and different chambers. And for example, they take the same attitude. They seem to think that the British government can control the BBC, which of course it can. So this is one area. I don't know if it's just ignorance or they seem to think that Biden should control her. I don't know what it is. On the other hand, Biden did take has taken quite hawkish lines on China about the United States defending Taiwan and so on. So really, it makes no difference if Biden says I'm not responsible for what she does, because as far as they're concerned, you're both senior American officials. You're the American president, and she's the speaker. So I imagine that was an awkward conversation. Um, the thing is, if Biden had stopped her, if he tried to stop her, then the criticism, and it would be justified criticism, would be that he was caving into Chinese pressure. One of the main attack lines from Republicans, in my view, a very unfair attack line, is this Beijing Biden smear. I think it's very I don't quite understand why they keep hammering that one, because actually Biden's quite been quite hawkish on China. His administration has called the Uyghur genocide a genocide. He has taken a much harder line on China than even some of his predecessors. I don't know. I'm not really sure what the basis for Beijing Biden is. Um, the State Department's been very clear in its condemnation of China's antics. So I think that's an unfair smear. I think a lot of it's just American politics, Trump supporters wanting to take a swipe at Biden. It's pathetic. Um, but I'm going to take some quotes from these op-eds. So, like I said, Mark Alman was praising her courage. But this is an interesting line, if I could just find it. And yeah, I wonder how thankful her for her principles the denizens of the Taiwanese capital Taipei would be when their city resembles downtown Kharkiv. In other words, if a war does break out, some might well blame Nancy Pelosi. Now, Almond's not blaming Pelosi. He's saying it's a courageous stance, but the overall theme of his piece is that is it really wise to provoke the dragon? Is it wise to give China an excuse? And it's easy to see where he's coming from, because my feeling is the moral argument is right, but in terms of realpolitik, because the argument goes something like this, and Alman covers this. The idea was that the West didn't sufficiently support Ukraine and take the concerns that Ukraine had before the invasion and didn't grandstand, therefore Russia felt emboldened to invade. So therefore, by preempting any invasion, by going to Taiwan first and showing solidarity, actually that's realpolitik and that's sensible. But he makes an interesting quote, if I can find it. There are moments in history when one event defines an era. The shooting of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 ignited the First World War, while the torpedoing of the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, a few hundred miles south of Taiwan in 1964, raised the curtain to the horrors of the Vietnam War. Did history judge a wholly unnecessary visit to Taiwan of a US House Speaker now in her 80s in a similar view? History is important here. And he goes on to say, I'm trying to find this quote because it's a good one. Um, where was it? Anyway, I can't find it at the moment. The way to, can't find it right now. Um, that's a pity. Never mind. No doubt it'll come to me afterwards. So that's his line. That it's unwise to provoke the dragon. And I've seen Pelosi in the Chinese social media. One of my Chinese contacts had this absurd piece of propaganda about China's overtures to Taiwan are entirely peaceful, and it's all about apparently Hua Chunying, who's the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, she's one of the most high-profile Chinese officials. She claimed that Taiwan is China because of the number of, and she cited this particular fast food chain that there's so many outlets within Taiwan, but the Taiwanese ridiculed this and pointed out, well, by that logic, there's so many ramen restaurants in Taipei, therefore Taiwan must be part of Japan. So it's an absurd argument and shows how desperate Beijing can sometimes be. So to get to Roger Boyd's piece, Nancy Pelosi is right to face down Xi threats. What he's driving at here is that in some ways China's a paper dragon. This is the overall theme of his piece, as I gather it. It's important to remember China last had combat experience 40 years ago, the Sino-Vietnamese War. Now, officially, China's never invaded another country. That's the line that they like to put out there. Vietnamese would have a different view on that. China did invade Vietnam in 1979, because although they were both communist states, they took a very different approach, and China wanted influence in the region, and they were kicked out in humiliation. Now, you'll never hear that on the Chinese narrative. This is interesting. There isn't a China century, says Ian Bremmer, a respected foreign policy analyst. Indeed, there might not even be a couple of China decades. It's increasingly plausible that China doesn't even overtake the US as the world's largest economy. Now, I haven't heard that sort of optimism for those of us who believe the CCP is a threat. Um, I haven't heard that sort of optimism for a while, but apparently this is coming from Ian Bremmer, who is a respected foreign policy analyst. I'm not familiar with the man, but that is be interesting to see what he's basing that on. Um, in short, and this is going back a little bit, Biden may well be overstating China's will to fight and to make good on its promises to push back on any perceived slight from the West. The zero COVID policy has set back China's ambitious growth plans. The population is set to shrink drastically. Academy of Social Sciences, one forecast by the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences projects a drop from 1.4 billion to 587 million by 2100. That's a massive decrease. So actually, China has some weaknesses. I don't think anyone should underestimate that it is a powerful country and it's a very assertive country. But the thing about COVID, for example, apparently Xi, like a lot of insecure dictators, is terrified of getting it. And he didn't attend G20 summits as a result. I think what's happened is this wolf warrior diplomacy we've seen in recent years. Chinese diplomats have got increasingly rude and vocal. But is this really a sign of confidence, or is this a sign that they're lashing out like cornered dogs? Um, I wonder about that. I wonder about that. I mean, you'll see very obvious signs of insecurity. For example, when the Olympics go on, and this country does very well, they'll say something like, "How can a small island with separatist problems get so many medals?" So they even project this in sports. I mean, China takes sports as politics, basically, which is the nature of totalitarian regimes. But there's a lot of ways to look at it in terms of actually an invasion of Taiwan. An amphibious assault on the island apparently is very difficult. One of the defining images of this whole story was those tanks going down the beach in Xiamen in Fujian province, which was bizarre. There was beach goers. It's in southern China, so it's good beaches down there. But apparently, they just these tanks rolling down the beach and curious locals taking pictures of it. Probably think, oh, our boys are going to stand up for China. But I think a lot of that's hot air, and I think it's psychological in a very cruel way, but also a way that the Taiwanese know full well. It's psychological bullying. It's kind of psychological warfare. Um, I honestly think that the Ukraine thing can't be underestimated in this. Russia and China have supported each other at varying levels, but of course the Russian Foreign Office has come out in support of China over this. But here's the thing: if China were to invade Taiwan, like I say, amphibious beach landings are apparently difficult because although Taiwan's an island, it's quite an urban society and it doesn't have that many beaches apparently on its western coast, which would be the part that China would have to invade. A bombing campaign would result in huge civilian fatalities, which would make China look like the total villains, and they'd have to censor that, but they couldn't because Taiwan has a free press. So logistically, even if China decided to go on in with brute force and not really care about the world's opinion, what are other Asian countries going to respond? You know, they can't reasonably take China's side over a small island territory like Taiwan because they too have felt the China threat. They countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, they could not back China over an invasion of Taiwan. I really don't think they could realistically do that. Um, Definitely not the Philippines or Japan. Partly because they've got very good relations with the West, but I think they too have know what Chinese wolfware diplomacy is like. I mean, when senior Chinese diplomats casually talk about um, using nuclear devices and so on. So it is tense and it is concerning to see those images, but I'm optimistic. I don't think there's going to be an imminent war. I do think, though, that in the region there has to be very, very careful moves because any misunderstanding by any power at a military level, there's already been, we've seen the videos of these transmissions between the American Navy and the Chinese Navy, sometimes the British Navy and the Chinese Navy. Any misunderstanding, any misfire could trigger a major conflict. I think China militarily could easily defeat Taiwan on its own, but I think the response would be very, very assertive from the West. The United States is, unless I'm mistaken, it is actually treaty bound to defend Taiwan. Um, Perhaps when we look at history, one of the biggest mistakes of the West, and in this country, the Attlee administration, was not to recognize Taiwanese independence. Maybe it could be argued the West should, but China would definitely read that as a provocative situation. Um, Benedict Rogers, who I have a lot of respect, a human rights activist and long-standing China critic, he even says that would be a provocation in one of his interviews. So I wonder should we have done it before China got so powerful? I don't know. Because, if China invaded and there was a brutal war, then recognizing Taiwanese independence would almost be like a show of solidarity at that time. But it's difficult to know what's going to happen here. I think from a moral perspective, there's absolutely no way that the free world could just turn a blind eye to this and allow an island of 26 million people to just be basically subject to an invasion by a totalitarian communist regime that thinks it just has a right to take ownership of that island against its residents' wishes. I mentioned in the last video the history of it, the fact that the Kuomintang went to Taiwan after the Chinese Civil War, but it's very clear the majority of Taiwanese do not want to be part of the mainland. But I think that what needs to happen is it may well be that Pelosi's visit will be seen in retrospect as provocative, but I do think it's right that the West takes a staunch line on China's threats. When China makes thuggish threats against Taiwan, I think we shouldn't equivocate. I think, for example, the Foreign Office should very clearly, very loudly say, this is a clear example of Chinese threats towards Taiwan. Whether or not Taiwan's part of the PRC, it's very clear that this is violent, threatening, hostile intent. And Beijing has to prove otherwise. I think we should exploit that. I think every time they make hawkish, thuggish threats, the West should really, really exploit that and really home in on it. Because they can only lie so much. They can only lie about their own words so much. So their typical go-to will be, this is an internal matter. It's Taiwan's part of China. It's an internal matter. That will be their go-to, even if it is, because consider, for example, the situation with Uyghurs. Beijing's had to go on the defensive and deny that. Of course, they say it's an internal matter, but they've even changed the narrative from that, from it's an internal matter to, oh, nothing, there's no genocide going on, and these are re-education centers. So they're making excuses. Now, what that tells me is they know that their lies are not holding ground. They know it. So I think when China makes these thuggish threats against Taiwan, those threats need to be magnified, exploited, and they need to be shown as the villains that they are. The world needs to see that they are. Of course, there'll be other totalitarian states that wouldn't, you know, would do the same thing with their own ambitions. But we cannot underestimate the power of propaganda. Even now, with lots of Russian state media blocked in the West, justifiably so, in my opinion, Russia still has a big voice in much of Africa. You know, its lies spread far and wide, the same with China. And there are a lot of people in this world who will back Russia and China for the sole reason that they're anti-West. Not necessarily that they're against the Taiwanese or the Ukrainians, but because they're against the West. So there's a lot of things going on in this dynamic, and I think the West needs to actually radically increase our propaganda. Call it what it is, propaganda. But you can have truthful propaganda. Propaganda doesn't equate to lies. Propaganda equates to a narrative of one side over the other. I mean, we had propaganda during World War II, but was saying that the Third Reich was our enemy and was this what it was propaganda, but it was good propaganda. It was justified propaganda. So I think, as a general policy, and I'm going to round this up, when China and Russia lies, as they frequently do, those lies need to be really, really homed in on, exposed, challenged, ridiculed. I think, especially with China, we've been too cautious for too long, and I give Nancy Pelosi credit for her courage and being a Western politician who hasn't backed down. She has not lacked consistency on this, and there are some others, but there are other Western leaders who waver on this and they tiptoe around China. You know, a bully can only go so far because bullies work with strength. They think if they're threatening enough, if they're scary enough, the other side will back down. I don't think we should be provocative for the sake of it. So, for example, recognizing Taiwanese independence right now would be a provocative move. But Nancy Pelosi's visit was not violent, it was a diplomatic visit. It wasn't accompanied by warships. And the Americans can point to that. You could say, well, wait a second, this was just a diplomatic visit, and we regularly visit international partners. So the Chinese can't say, they can only say it's provocative to an extent because it wasn't like the United States then conducted some massive military drill on Taiwan accompanying with that visit, which would definitely be poking the dragon. The bottom line is, even if China believes Taiwan part of its territory, where's the moral argument here? Because their whole pitch is threats, violence, and force and bullying. It's not saying to the Taiwanese, you're our brothers and sisters, you're part of the Chinese family. Come to us. You know, we're there for you. We're on your side. No, it's we demand that you shut up and you cower before us and you be our slaves. Nah, the Taiwanese aren't going to tolerate that. I mean, put it this way, I'll make an analogy. Let's say the British government sent in tanks to Edinburgh or Glasgow to stop Scottish independence. Then the British government would be seen in the eyes of the world as thugs and bullies. So we don't do that because that's not what we are. It's not how democracy works. Rather, we stop Scottish independence by persuasion, by strong argument, by pointing out the facts, by pointing out that England and Scotland are better together, by a host of other things. But this is the difference between a totalitarian state and a democracy. So that's why the Chinese really have no leg to stand on in terms of moral high ground. None. Because they have done nothing to persuade the Taiwanese. The same with the Hong Kongers. They've utterly failed in that regard. So all they have like the bully boys that they are, is threats and force. I think that needs to be really, really highlighted. As for the nationalistic brainwashing, it's very difficult to counter that because it is deeply, deeply embedded. I do think, though, I've said this before, we need to be more assertive on the home guard. I think we need to be assertive for those who would advocate for the CCP whilst they have a visa in this country. I don't want to draw this out too much because I've mentioned it a lot before. That can be some Chinese students who act in a very nationalistic way, or it could be business people. I think we should watch them very carefully. Now, people might say that's a soft target, but Beijing exploits it. Beijing exploits it. We should say to them, you have your rules, we have our rules. Come to this country and promote the CCP. Um, you're interfering with our democracy. You're trying to undermine our democracy. And this is an area where the West needs to be quite assertive because they'll fire back, what about free speech? Well, let them, let them. I mean, when it comes to that, they have no free speech, so they can't really lecture us on that in any way, shape, or form. Because China will do this. They will look at any shortcoming in the West as they see it. Take, for example, the scandal in Canada last year, and it was a major scandal, the way Indigenous children were treated by the church. That was appalling, and it was a dark stain on modern Canadian history. But I remember the Chinese were really exploiting that. Oh, Canada can't lecture us about human rights. Look at this. I remember at the time seeing a cartoon and it showed this thing that Canada was trying to deal with. Trudeau apologized. There was a government inquiry and it was a major scandal. But it showed the Chinese on top of a massive pile of skulls and Tiananmen Square, the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward. In other words, whatever dark side Canada has, it's dwarfed by the dark side of what the Communist Party has done. And then it showed a Chinese official from the top of that pile of skulls pointing down and shouting, hypocrites, human rights. In other words, they really are in no position to lecture. So I think on things like that, the West need to be a lot more vocal and a lot more basically telling them to back off. I think we need to expose their lies. For too long now, I think we've kind of ignored this and kind of been like, well, it's history, and we'll focus on the present. I think we need to utterly, utterly expose the CTP for what it is. Um, we need to stop thinking that they cannot be challenged. And I think it's possible to do that without being provocative for the sake of it. Don't recognize Taiwanese independence at this point. Um, you know, there's areas like that that we could be quite assertive on. But I do feel that ultimately this visit, morally, I think it's justified. Practically, it might give Beijing an excuse, but only short termism. I'll just conclude what Roger Boyce said. Um, Pelosi, emboldened perhaps by the likelihood of retirement after the midterm elections, does not cower at the prospect of a US China war. Common sense tells her that it isn't going to happen, at least not for a decade, and for sure not this August. That has freed her to take risks and tell it how it is. The US is letting itself be intimidated by Xi, the bluffer. She's going out there saying that we should no longer allow ourselves to be pushed around by this paper tiger.